I found him in the ruins of a Veth processing station, 3 days after we took the ridge. He was tucked behind a collapsed ferrocrete slab, barely bigger than my forearm, curled into a shape so tight, and still I almost stepped over him without looking down. Almost. Something made me stop, some old animal instinct that has nothing to do with training, and I crouched and pulled out my handlight and put it on him. He was a Veth cub, or what was left of one. You have to understand what the Veth look like up close, because the briefings don't do it justice. They're not the sleek, elegant predators the news feeds showed in those first months, when command was still trying to keep people calm. Up close, a Veth is somewhere between a leopard and a thing that crawled out of a fever dream. 6 limbs. The front 4 walk or grip depending on the terrain. The rear 2 are pure drive, thick-muscled, capable of covering 40 meters in 2 seconds when a full-grown Veth is motivated. Their hide is banded black and deep amber, shifting in the light, and it's not fur, not exactly. More like overlapping scales that flex with each breath, each one a separate sensor drinking in heat and pressure and air movement. Their heads are broad, flat, with 4 forward-facing eyes arranged in a diamond, and their mouths open in 4 directions, which you only learn the first time one takes a bite out of someone you know. The cub looked like a smaller, broken version of that. His banding was wrong. Instead of the sharp amber-black contrast that marks a healthy Veth from birth, his coloring was faded, washed out, almost gray in places, like someone had printed him at half resolution. 2 of his 6 limbs were undersized, noticeably shorter than the other 4, and the way they curled against his body made it clear they didn't bear weight properly. His 4 eyes were open but unfocused, tracking nothing, catching the light of my handlight and giving it back as a dull, filmed-over gleam. He was breathing, barely. I knew what had happened without needing to think hard about it. The Veth don't keep the weak. That's not cruelty by their standards, it's mathematics. The hive calculates. Every cub is assessed at birth. Viable specimens are integrated into the creche clusters, fed, sheltered, trained toward whatever role the hive determines they'll fill. Non-viable specimens are placed at the perimeter of whatever the Veth use as a home space and left. Not killed, just left. The hive doesn't waste the energy on killing what it's already written off. They walk away and they don't look back, and as far as the collective intelligence of the Veth is concerned, that cub stops existing the moment they put him down. He'd been left behind when the hive evacuated ahead of our assault. In the chaos of the ridge assault and the 3 days of consolidation after, no one had come back for him. No one was coming back. I looked at him for a long time. My fire team was dead. Kowalski had gone down on the first day of the ridge push, a Veth striker getting under his guard at close range. I didn't see it happen, only heard it, and by the time I turned around there was nothing I could do but keep moving. Chen lasted until day 2, a long-range strike from a Veth elder that none of us saw coming. Reeves made it all the way to the processing station, got his boot through the door, and then a structural collapse took the east wall of the building and he went down with it. We dug for 4 hours. We found him, but not in time. So I was the fire team, I was it. I reached down and I picked up the cub. He didn't fight me. He didn't have the energy. He made a sound, not a growl, not anything I'd call threatening, a low, vibrating hum that I felt more in my gloved hands than heard with my ears. And then he went still and let me hold him against my chest. He weighed almost nothing. Through my body armor I could feel the unsteady flutter of his breathing, too fast and too shallow, the rhythm of a body that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to continue. I tucked him inside my jacket, against my side where the armor had an inner layer that held heat. I told myself I was doing it because he was intel. A live Veth specimen, even a juvenile, was valuable. Command would want to study him. That's what I told myself. I carried him back to the forward operating base. The medic on duty was a woman named Ferris. She'd been a veterinarian before the war, which made her more useful than half the combat medics I'd served with. because the Veth had biology and the Veth had cubs, and she was one of the few people who'd actually studied what we knew about Veth physiology rather than just cataloging how to kill them. She looked at the cub for a long time without touching him, then looked at me, then looked at the cub again. "You carried this thing 3 kilometers through a live combat zone," she said. "4," I said. She shook her head slowly, then she got to work. The cub's condition was straightforward, in the grim arithmetic of medical triage. Malnourished, dehydrated. The 2 undersized limbs were developmental, not injured. He'd been born with them that way, which was why the hive had put him out. There was an infection working through his lower respiratory tract, detectable by the slight audible rasp on every 3rd or 4th breath once you knew to listen for it. His immune system was fighting it, but barely, and without intervention the infection would win in a few days. Ferris synthesized what she could from the limited data on Veth biology in the medical database. She made no promises. She administered 2 compounds she said might help, and 2 she said almost certainly wouldn't hurt. She rigged a small heat unit in a corner of the medical bay and put the cub in it on a folded thermal blanket and told me not to get attached. I slept on the floor of the medical bay that night. The cub was still breathing in the morning. Command found out, of course. In a forward operating base with 200 personnel, nothing stays private. Colonel Marsh called me into his office on the 2nd day and told me in the even, measured tone he used for things that genuinely irritated him that I was not running a rescue operation for enemy biological specimens, and that the cub was to be transferred to the intelligence division for study. I told him the cub would die in transport, without continued medical supervision. He told me that was an acceptable outcome from a mission standpoint. I told him, respectfully, that Dr. Ferris disagreed, and that her professional assessment was that a live, developing Veth specimen studied over weeks would yield more actionable intelligence than a dead one studied over days. He looked at me for a while. Marsh was a practical man. That's the only reason I'm still here to tell this story. He was practical, not sentimental, and practicality occasionally lands on the same answer as mercy. "Keep it in the medical bay," he said. "Document everything. The moment it's a security risk, it goes to intel. Understood?" Understood. The cub didn't die. He got worse before he got better. 3 days where Ferris and I watched the respiratory infection tighten its grip, where his breathing went from raspy to labored to something that sounded like he was pulling air through wet cloth. On the 4th night, I sat on the floor next to his heat unit, and I talked to him quietly, not because I thought he could understand me, but because silence felt like giving up and I'd had enough of giving up. I talked about nothing. About the town I grew up in, about my father's workshop, about the first time I ever saw snow. The cub lay still and breathed his wet, struggling breaths, and his 4 eyes were half closed and filmed. On the 5th morning, the infection broke. His breathing cleared over the course of about 2 hours. I watched it happen, sitting in the corner of the medical bay with a cold cup of coffee, watching his ribcage rise and fall with steadily increasing ease. By midday, he was lifting his head. By evening, he was watching me. Not the room, not the sounds of the base around him, me. I don't know what a Veth cub's cognition looks like at that developmental stage. I don't think anyone did then. What I know is that from the moment he started recovering, he tracked me specifically, head turning when I entered the room, eyes following when I moved. Not threatening, not submissive exactly, attentive. The way a soldier watches someone they've decided to trust. I started calling him Ash, after the color of his washed-out banding, which I'd come to think of as distinctive rather than wrong. Ferris told me not to name him. I named him anyway. The weeks that followed were the strangest of the war for me, and the war had already handed me a full inventory of strange. The Veth were regrouping beyond the ridge line. Signals intelligence tracked their movements. Deep thumping patterns of communication that our translators still only partially decoded. the hive mind coordinating the way a brain coordinates a body, below the level of language, below the level of thought as we understood it. Command knew a counterassault was coming. The question was when and with how much. Meanwhile, Ash learned to walk. Not relearn, he'd never learned properly, because the undersized limbs had made conventional Veth locomotion impossible. What he worked out on the medical bay floor was his own adaptation. The 4 standard limbs did the primary work. The 2 smaller ones stabilized and redirected, functioning more like rudders than legs. It was slower than a healthy Veth cub's movement. It was also more precise. He could navigate around obstacles that would require a healthy cub to slow down or stop, because his adaptation had made him think about the geometry of each step, rather than relying on the automatic competence that comes with standard equipment. I watched him figure this out over 3 or 4 days, making small adjustments, testing different configurations, failing and adjusting and trying again. It reminded me of something. It took me a while to put a name to it. It reminded me of my people. He grew. The Veth juvenile development curve is steep. Ferris had found a developmental study in the intelligence archives, pre-war academic work from when contact with the Veth was still considered a diplomatic problem rather than a military one. Cubs go from helpless to capable in a matter of months. Ash was already past the helpless stage when I found him. Over the following weeks, he moved through capable and into something harder to categorize. He learned where I slept. He started appearing there. The first time I woke up and found him curled against the back of my legs, I lay still for a long time trying to decide what to feel about it. He was warm. His banding had deepened as his health improved, still not the sharp amber black of a healthy Veth, but richer, with a metallic sheen on the darker bands that caught the light in a way that made you look twice. His 6 limbs were tucked close. His breathing was slow and even. I didn't move him. Command's reaction to Ash evolved in phases. The first phase was institutional hostility. Security personnel wanting him caged, intelligence officers wanting him transferred, a logistics officer who filed 3 separate complaints about the inappropriate billeting of enemy specimens in personnel quarters. The second phase was grudging tolerance, driven partly by Marsh's continued pragmatic approval and partly by the fact that Ash, left to his own devices, was quiet and caused no problems and ignored everyone in the base except me. The third phase, the one I hadn't anticipated, was something approaching fascination. Ash had started doing something that none of the intelligence briefings had prepared anyone for. He was watching us train. Not from a distance. He'd position himself at the edge of whatever space we were using, the cleared ground behind the motor pool, the corridor where we ran hand-to-hand drills, the firing range when we ran qualification, and he'd sit in that precise, contained way of his, all 4 eyes tracking, and he'd watch. He never interfered, never made sounds. Just watched with an attention that was absolute and uncomfortable, and reminded me, every time, that whatever was behind those 4 eyes was processing information in ways I couldn't fully map. Ferris said he was in the developmental stage where Veth cubs typically observe the adults of the hive and begin integrating behavioral patterns. The hive provides the patterns. We were providing ours. I don't know what he made of us those first months. I know what he did with what he observed. He started practicing. Not our specific movements. His body wasn't built for bipedal combat drills. But he was working out something in his own terms, running the same sequences over and over on the ground behind the medical bay, combining the adaptive movement patterns he'd developed for his own physique with something new, something purposeful. When he ran the sequences, he wasn't testing his body anymore. He was drilling it. The Veth counter-assault came in the 43rd day after I found him. It came at night, which we hadn't anticipated. The Veth typically assault in daylight, their multi-spectrum vision giving them no particular advantage in darkness over human night vision gear, and the prevailing tactical assumption had been that they preferred conditions where their physical advantages were maximized. We were wrong, or they changed their doctrine. Either way, the first warning was the perimeter alarm at 2:30, and by the time I had my boots on and my rifle in my hands, the base was already taking fire. They came in 3 waves. That was new too. The Veth typically assault as a single mass. The hive-mind doesn't coordinate the way separate units coordinate. It directs the way a single organism directs its own limbs, all at once, overwhelming force concentrated at a point. 3 distinct waves meant something had changed in their tactical thinking. Something had gotten smarter. The first wave hit the eastern perimeter and the southern gate simultaneously. They were taking losses. Our prepared positions were good and our people were professionals, but they were pressing forward regardless of cost in a way that told me the first wave wasn't trying to break through. It was measuring us, mapping our response patterns, our firepower distribution, our reaction times, feeding the hive. I was on the northern wall when the second wave hit, and the second wave came straight at the section I was holding with 6 other personnel. They were faster than the first group selected for it. I understood later, specifically chosen among the assault force for speed and aggression, and they hit the wall before we'd fully repositioned from covering the eastern diversion. I don't remember all of it clearly. Combat compresses and stretches time in ways that I've stopped trying to explain to people who haven't been in it. What I remember is the noise, the Veth assault cry, which is subsonic and felt in the chest before it's heard by the ears, and the wall section to my left going down, and 3 Veth clearing the gap before anyone could redirect fire. And then it was close quarters, which is where every advantage we had meant the least. I remember the one that got past my guard. Big, amber-black banding, sharp and perfect, 6 limbs all fully functional, coming at me low the way they do when they're going for the kill stroke. I got my rifle up between us, and it was enough to redirect the first strike but not stop it, and we went down together, and I was working on the problem of getting the muzzle clear when I heard something. Not a Veth assault cry, not anything in the Veth behavioral vocabulary that I knew. A sound like tearing metal wrapped in a scream. The Veth on top of me stopped moving. Not hesitation, full stop, head turning, all 4 eyes moving toward the sound. I felt its weight shift as its attention broke from me entirely, which shouldn't happen. A Veth in a kill position doesn't break attention. The hive mind holds them on target the way a hand holds a tool. Then Ash hit it. He came off the top of the wall section. I found out later he'd been on the wall, watching since the first alarm, and he hit the Veth that had me pinned from above and behind, which are the 2 directions that a Veth in a kill crouch cannot defend simultaneously. He was half the other Veth's size. He had 2 undersized limbs and washed-out banding, and he'd been left for dead by his own kind because the hive had looked at him and calculated that he would never be worth what he cost. He fought like something that had spent 3 months watching humans train for the worst possible situation, and then spent 3 months figuring out how to do it in a body that was never designed for it. He was not trying to kill the other Veth. I don't think killing was the point. The point was disruption, breaking the locked attention of the kill position, creating the moment's gap that changes the equation. That's what he'd understood from watching us drill. We don't win straight-up physical contests against the Veth. We win the moments between moments. We win the half-second where they're processing something they didn't expect. He gave me the half-second. I don't need to say what I did with it. The engagement lasted another 40 minutes after that. The third wave hit the western approach and was turned back. Command had anticipated it by then, reading the pattern, shifting reserves. By 400, the base perimeter was clear. By 500, we had casualty counts, 11 dead, 23 wounded, 8 seriously. The Veth had lost more than we could count. The assault force had been large. We'd held. Ash was at the back of the medical bay when I found him, sitting in his characteristic contained way, and he was bleeding from 3 places where the Veth he'd hit had gotten its secondary limbs into him before I'd resolved the situation. None of the wounds were deep. He watched me come toward him with those 4 eyes, calm and steady, and when I crouched down in front of him, I couldn't think of a single thing to say that measured up to what had just happened. I put my hand on the side of his head, carefully, the way you'd rest your hand on the shoulder of someone who'd done something you couldn't put into words. He leaned into it, just slightly, just enough. Ferris treated his wounds, and told me again not to get attached. The weeks after the counter-assault changed things at the base in ways that were hard to quantify but impossible to miss. It started with personnel who'd been on the northern wall that night. They'd seen what Ash did and they started treating him differently. Not like a pet, not like a mascot, more like they treated each other after a fight where someone had your back. Acknowledgement, a kind of gravity. The complaints to command about the enemy specimen in the quarters stopped. The security personnel who'd wanted him caged started nodding at him when they passed in the corridor. Command scheduled a formal debrief on the incident. I gave my account. 3 other personnel gave theirs. The intelligence officer who reviewed the recordings from the wall cameras was quiet for a long time afterward, and then asked me, in the careful tone of someone choosing words, whether I thought Ash had acted on instinct or on decision. I told him I didn't think that was the right question. He asked me what the right question was. I told him the right question was whether the distinction mattered. He didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure I did either, but I'd had weeks of watching Ash drill sequences he designed himself, watching him adapt and refine and adjust, and I'd stopped being able to separate instinct from decision in what I observed. Maybe they're not as separate as we assume. Maybe that's something we tell ourselves to keep the categories clean. The intelligence community's interest in Ash shifted after the debrief. They weren't wrong to be interested. A Veth who'd been raised in proximity to humans, who'd integrated human behavioral patterns without losing Veth physical capabilities, who demonstrated the ability to apply those patterns tactically in a live engagement. That was significant. That was the kind of significant that people write reports about, and those reports go up chains of command, and eventually reach people who make large decisions. I knew what was coming before it arrived. Colonel Marsh called me in 6 weeks after the counter-assault. He had 2 people in the room I didn't know, civilian clothes, the kind of civilian clothes that don't quite work because they're worn by people who are used to uniforms. He was straight about it. They wanted Ash for a study program. Not dissection, not captivity in any punitive sense. A long-term behavioral and cognitive study, controlled environment, the full resources of a research facility rather than a forward operating base medical bay. He told me it wasn't my decision to make. I told him I understood. I sat with Ash that night, in the quarters we'd shared for months, and he watched me the way he always did, that absolute processing attention. And I talked to him the way I had on the night I thought I was going to lose him to the infection. Not because he could understand the words, because silence felt wrong. I told him what was coming. I told him I hadn't figured out how to stop it. I told him that the thing he'd done on the wall that night had probably made him more valuable than he was safe. And that was the particular irony of being useful in a war. Usefulness attracts attention, and attention has consequences. He put his head in my lap somewhere around the 3rd hour of me talking. Just rested it there, heavy and warm, and watched the wall with those 4 steady eyes. They came for him in the morning. I walked him out to the transport. The 2 researchers were professional and careful with him, and I could see they were genuinely interested, not malicious, which helped and didn't help in equal measure. Ash walked beside me without a lead or a restraint. No one had ever needed a restraint with him, and when we reached the transport he stopped and turned and looked at me for a long time. I crouched down. I put my hand on the side of his head. He held still. Then he made the sound I'd first heard in the ruins of the processing station, that low, felt more than heard vibration, and it had a different quality to it than it had then. Then it had been the sound of a body that didn't know what it was hanging on to. Now it was something else. something I don't have a precise word for. He turned and boarded the transport. I stood there until the transport was gone. That was the last time I saw Ash in the field. What happened after was reported to me in increments, through channels that got more official and more indirect the further along it went. The nature of classified programs, the way information gets both more important and less accessible as it moves up. The study went on for 2 years. I got quarterly reports in the first year, monthly summaries in the second. Ash continued to develop. His integration of human behavioral patterns deepened in ways the researchers described as unprecedented, not imitation. They were careful to clarify, but synthesis. He wasn't doing what humans did. He was doing what Ash did, which had absorbed and rebuilt what humans did into something that couldn't be attributed to either origin cleanly. His adaptation for his undersized limbs continued to develop. By the end of the first year, the research team's biomechanical consultants had stopped calling it a disability and started calling it a distinct locomotion strategy. He was faster than a standard-build Veth over complex terrain, more maneuverable in confined spaces. In the controlled testing environment, against simulated Veth assault scenarios built from field data, he outperformed every metric they'd set. The research team also discovered something that hadn't been in any of the pre-war academic work on Veth cognition. He remembered. The Veth hive-mind doesn't retain individual memory the way isolated minds do. The collective retains tactical data, environmental mapping, prey behavior patterns, but those are functional archives, not personal histories. Individual Veth aren't built for individual memory because the individual isn't the unit that matters. The hive is. What one unit experiences feeds the hive, and the individual unit moves forward without accumulating a past. Ash accumulated a past. They documented it carefully, tested it rigorously, verified it against every control they had. He retained specific events in sequence. He retained cause and effect. He retained the relationship between what had happened and what he'd done about it and what had followed from that. The research team's lead cognitive scientist wrote a paper that I was eventually cleared to read. She was careful in her language, scientific careful, not emotional careful, but the conclusion was stated plainly. Ash had developed individual memory architecture because he'd been raised in an environment where individual memory was the norm. He'd absorbed it the way he'd absorbed the locomotion principles and the tactical patterns, not copying them, but generating his own version of them in response to sustained exposure. He remembered me. The paper noted it specifically. In every assessment protocol that involved human interaction, he displayed distinct recognition patterns when shown images or recordings of his original handler that he did not display for any other individual. The paper called it persistent individual recognition with associated behavioral indicators. I read that 3 times sitting in a prefab office on the other side of the planet from the research facility, in a forward area that had its own problems and its own dead to count. And I didn't have anything useful to think after the 3rd reading, so I put the report down and went back to work. The war shifted in the 3rd year. Not ended, shifted. The Veth pulled back from the frontier systems they'd taken in the first years of the conflict, consolidated, stopped pressing. Command didn't trust it. The analysts didn't trust it. Everyone who'd been in the field long enough to understand how the hive mind worked didn't trust it, because the hive mind doesn't retreat out of exhaustion or demoralization. It retreats because it's recalculating. The recalculation took 4 months. When it resolved, it didn't look like anything any of our models had predicted. A signal came through the standard communication frequencies that the Veth had never used before. It came in a language, not the subsonic pattern pulses of hive coordination, not the limited vocalization catalog that our translators had partially mapped actual constructed language, assembled from human linguistic structures with Veth conceptual content. Imperfect, incomplete, functional. The message asked for a meeting. I don't have clearance to know most of what happened in the following months. Diplomatic processes at that level don't involve forward area sergeants. What I know is what was eventually made public, and what I pieced together from sources I trust. The meeting happened. Then more meetings. The Veth representatives communicated in the hybrid language and human translators responded, and the process was slow and difficult, and several times it came close to collapsing entirely. But it continued. The intelligence community figured out where the hybrid language had come from faster than the diplomatic community did. The cognitive patterns in it, the specific ways that Veth conceptual frameworks had been mapped onto human linguistic structures, bore a signature that two different research teams independently identified. The signature was Ash's. I don't know what role he played exactly, because that information is still restricted, and I suspect it'll be restricted for a long time. What I know is that something that had begun in the ruins of a processing station, with a sick cub that the hive had written off as a failed calculation, had found its way into the space between two species trying to find a language for something other than war. Something that had been discarded for being insufficient had built the bridge. The ceasefire was announced 14 months after the first signal. I was on a troop transport heading for the next forward area when it came through, and the whole compartment went quiet in a way that compartments full of soldiers go quiet when they're processing news they're not quite ready to believe. The ceasefire wasn't peace. Everyone knew that. The ground we'd taken and the ground we'd lost, and the people on both sides who weren't coming back, none of that resolves cleanly because a ceasefire is announced. But the guns stopped. For the moment, the guns stopped. I submitted a request through the research program's administrative office 3 days after the announcement. It took 8 weeks to process. The response was a travel authorization and a date and a facility address in a region that had been outside the combat zone for the past year. I took leave. I made the trip. The facility was built into the side of a coastal ridge. The research team liked the natural temperature gradient. It turned out, because it gave them more control over the environmental parameters of the study spaces. A civilian administrator met me at the entrance and walked me through 2 security checkpoints and down a long corridor that smelled like salt air and antiseptic, and something else I couldn't immediately name. The lead researcher met me outside the last door. She was younger than I'd expected from her writing, and she had the slightly worn look of someone who'd been doing intense work for a long time and had stopped noticing how tired they were. She told me he'd been calm all morning. I asked how she knew he was expecting me. She said that was the right question. She opened the door. The space beyond was large, not a cage, not a cell, a room with multiple levels and complex terrain features and large panels that let in the coastal light. He was at the far end when I came in, occupying one of the upper levels, and his head turned the moment the door opened. He was large. That was the first adjustment my mind had to make. The Veth juvenile development curve is steep, and 3 years had put size on him that the cub I remembered hadn't had. His banding had settled into its mature pattern, that distinctive grayish metallic quality that was nothing like standard Veth coloring and everything like itself. The 2 undersized limbs had grown but maintained their proportional difference, built into his adult frame as a feature rather than an error. He came down from the upper level in the movement pattern I remembered, the adaptive, geometry-conscious motion that was slower than standard Veth and more precise, reading the terrain in each step, nothing wasted. He crossed the room and stopped in front of me and looked at me with 4 steady eyes. I crouched down the way I always had, put my hand on the side of his head. He leaned into it, just slightly, just enough. Same as the last time. 3 years and a ceasefire and whatever he'd become and whatever the world had become, and it was the same. I stayed for a week. We didn't speak, obviously. I had no access to the hybrid language, and he had no human vocalization. But communication doesn't require a shared language when it's built from enough shared history, and we had 3 years of history on top of the months that had preceded it, and we spent the week in the way of people who have things to say, and have chosen other ways of saying them. I watched him work through the sequences he'd refined over the years, and they were extraordinary, not human, not Veth, but something built from both that had its own logic and its own beauty. I helped him run them the way I'd have helped a squad mate drill, reading the sequences and responding to them, and the lead researcher told me on the fourth day that the data they were getting from that week was the most significant in 18 months. I told her I was glad to be useful. On the last morning, I sat with him in the coastal light for a long time without moving. He was calm. He's always been calm in a way that took me a while to understand, not the calm of something that doesn't feel anything, but the calm of something that has worked through the feeling and arrived at an understanding it can carry. I thought about the hive-mind's calculation all those years ago. The assessment that had looked at this particular cub, the wrong coloring, the undersized limbs, the insufficient measurements, and determined that he would never be worth what he cost. The cold arithmetic of the collective, writing off what it couldn't use. What the collective hadn't calculated was what happens when the thing you write off is found by someone who doesn't do that kind of arithmetic, who picks it up not because it's useful, but because it's there, and it's breathing, and something in the very old part of a human brain says that breathing matters. The hive mind is vast and ancient and capable of things that still keep our best analysts up at night, but it doesn't know how to account for that. It never has. It wrote off a cub, and the cub found a human, and the human kept him alive, and 3 years later the cub was building languages between two species that had spent the better part of a decade trying to eradicate each other. Not because he was the strongest, not because he was built right, because he'd learned, in the only way you really learn anything, by surviving what was in front of him and paying attention and adapting, and not letting the assessment of what he was supposed to be determine what he actually became. I said goodbye at the door. He watched me from the center of the room, those 4 eyes steady and unreachable, and completely known to me in every way that matters. I walked out into the coastal morning. The ceasefire held. It still holds, as of the last report I trusted. No one's calling it peace yet. The ground between what we are and what we might become is still being crossed, one difficult step at a time, in a language that a discarded cub built from what he'd been given. That's enough. For now, that's enough.